This morning we continue with our series David, and we're going to discover that there are many giants that David came up against. And we encounter these same giants today, and these giants have the potential to undermine even the most dedicated Christian, because the ways of God are most unappealing and seem irrelevant when we are angry, isolated, or afraid. These three giants can cause us to crash in every moral and ethical value we have, pushing us beyond the guardrails we have placed around ourselves relationally, physically, and financially. We've all experienced this. Think about your greatest regret. Chances are it was one or a combination of these three things. You were either super angry, or you felt rejected, or you were just afraid. And unfortunately, they will be part of your future regrets as well. And the reason this happens to us is this. When we are overwhelmed with one or two of these conditions, we feel compelled to do something. It's this urgency you feel. And you have to do something to relieve that tension inside. In fact, we feel compelled to do anything. And because of this, oftentimes, we will do the wrong thing. And things don't get better, things usually get much worse. And we make our lives more complicated. We end up angrier, lonelier, and even more afraid. And this brings us to the second part of David. David had two giant failures in his life. This morning we're going to talk about one of these. It takes place when David was in his 20s. Following his defeat of Goliath, David becomes the most famous person in Israel. At only 15 years old, David becomes a legend. And the king also recognizes this. David is becoming too influential and has too much power. And the king, Saul, is concerned. Because the king was very insecure himself. And so he comes up with a plan. And it might have been a good plan if David hadn't been who David was. The king decides to offer one of his daughters to David in marriage. This arrangement would bring David into his family, giving the king control over David. But David's response comes as a surprise. He tells the king, "I'm not worthy to be the king's son-in-law." David refuses the king's offer. And when the people hear this, they think David is amazing. What a humble person he is. And this elevates David even more. Meanwhile, as the king is trying to find another way to control David, David falls in love with one of the king's other daughters, Michal. And they get married. And in addition to this, David has become best friends with the king's son, Jonathan. And soon King Saul realizes that his attempt to control David, he has become even more powerful and influential, and he's now even part of his family. 7 years pass by, and David goes in and out of King Saul's favor. But the king's jealousy has now turned into hatred. And he decides he needs to get rid of David. But he can't be the one to do it. So he goes to plan B, get rid of David. The king sends David on impossible missions, hoping he will die in the hands of the Philistines. But David returns victorious in every case. And the people love him even more. And at this point, you almost have to feel a little bad for King Saul. How miserable he must have felt. The king also discovers that every time he tries to arrest David, his own son, Jonathan, or his daughter, Michal, helps David escape. The day comes when Saul can't take it anymore, and the scene takes place over dinner. Now, because of the turbulence with the king, David has been missing dinner. And each time the king would ask Jonathan, "Where's David?" And Jonathan would make up some excuse to tell his father. But one night, as everyone is gathered at the table except David, the king loses it. Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a twisted, rebellious woman, do you think I don't know that you want him to be king in your place, shaming yourself and your mother? As long as that son of Jesse is alive, you'll never be king. Now go and get him so I can kill him." Saul said this because Jonathan was the next in line to be king of Israel, and he wanted his legacy to last. The king leaves the room, and Jonathan also leaves to warn David. He finds David and tells him, "You've got to leave the country. My father wants you dead." David now is 22 years old. He's been rejected by the king and is in fear for his life. And he did nothing wrong. He is abandoned, angry, and afraid. And he does what many of us do when we are abandoned, angry, and afraid. We panicked. And as we read David's story, it's easy for us to question what David does. But there are people that are watching some of us right now in this room asking those same questions. Because we do the same thing. How many times have we looked back on something we did and asked ourselves, why did I do that? Why did I go there? It's real simple. When we feel abandoned, angry, or afraid, we panic. And this is what David did. Here's what David did. At that time, the place of worship was in the city of Nob. This was where the tabernacle was, where the Ark of the Covenant was placed. And this was where all the priests and their families lived. Ahimelech was the high priest. So David decides to go there. However, when David enters the tabernacle, Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is there no one with you?" David always had at least 1,000 soldiers with him. David answered Ahimelech the priest, David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king sent me on a mission and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place.'" David lies to the high priest, even though it's against the law he loves. In fact, he's just yards away from the Ark of the Covenant, which contains the 10 Commandments. So why does he lie? Because he's afraid. And when you're afraid, you're angry, and you feel abandoned. David was desperate to hide himself from the king. The story continues. David then asks for some food. "Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread, or whatever you can find." But the priest answered David, "I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here." And this sounds all a little strange to the priest. The king's son-in-law, the captain of the bodyguards, shows up wanting food. But Ahimelech gives David the bread. Then David continues to lie. David asked Ahimelech, "Don't you have a spear or a sword here?" "I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the king's mission was urgent." Now, I want us to take a moment here and think about what David is doing, because this has happened to you and this has happened to me. When we take matters into our own hands, when we're afraid, or when there's something we're running away from, we will justify our actions based on our condition. Listen to what happens next. The priest replied, "The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here." This was a wake-up call to David. This was the moment when his eyes should have been opened. The only weapon available was the same weapon he used 7 years ago to kill Goliath with. David had dedicated this sword to God and gave it to the high priest, recognizing that God delivered him and Israel that day. But amazingly, David misses this moment. And what happened to David is the same thing that happens to you and happens to me. God gives us a moment to realize we have taken matters into our own hands, and we can miss it, just like David did. Because these three giants, fear, anger, and loneliness, have the potential to cause you and I to forget the defeated giants in our past. These three giants can undermine our faith in God by placing fear, anger, and loneliness in our hearts. David looks at the sword, and instead of remembering what God did in his past, he tells Ahimelech this, "There is none like it. Give it to me." And this would be one of the two giant decisions that David would regret the rest of his life. And it would become a permanent part of the story in his life. Just like the giant decisions we make without God become a permanent part of the story in our life. When we take matters into our own hands, the choices we make during these times often lead to regret. You probably know of someone right now making a terrible decision based on anger, fear, and based on feeling all alone. And you know they're going to regret the decisions they're making because it's easy to see in someone else's life, but we fail to see it in our own life. And the reason for this is because we convince ourselves that our situation is different from theirs. And this is what David did. In fact, David had convinced himself, if God were with me, this wouldn't be happening to me. Sound familiar? The truth is, it's so easy to trust God when we have nothing to trust him with and nothing to trust him for. Think about it. When things are going great, how hard is it to trust God? It's harder to trust God when things that we value start to slip away. David chooses to take matters into his own hands, and he takes the sword. And guess where he goes? To the land of the Philistines. Good move, right? Not only that, he carries Goliath's sword with him into Goliath's hometown. And it gets even crazier. He goes to the leader of the Philistine army and tells him, "I want to fight for you." And they look at him like, "What? You come here with the very sword you killed Goliath with, and you ask now to fight against your own army?" And at that moment, David realizes he's surrounded by the enemy. Sound familiar? We've all put ourselves in those places. Been there, done that. That wonderful revelation, what have I done? And the only thing David can do, as far as he's concerned, is to take matters into his own hands again. And he comes up with this brilliant way out. He pretended to be insane in their presence, and while he was in their hands, he acted like a madman. So now we have a king that's really lost it, and a soon-to-be king pretending he's lost it. But David's idea manages to get him away from the Philistines. Now, meanwhile, Saul has found out what has happened in the city of Nob, and he's furious. And he now believes that Ahimelech, the priest, is against him too. King Saul immediately sent for Ahimelech and all his family who served as priests at Nob. When they arrived, Saul shouted at him. "Why have you and the son of Jesse conspired against me?" Saul demanded. "Why did you give him food and a sword? Why have you consulted God for him? Why have you encouraged him to kill me, as he is trying to do this very day?" Ahimelech denies all this. But remember, the king is crazy. And he orders Ahimelech and his family and all the priests and every man, woman, and child to be killed. But one of the sons of Ahimelech manages to escape, and he goes right to David. And he tells David what happened, and David is broken. Oh? I missed one, I'm sorry. Okay. "I am responsible for the death of your whole family. Stay with me, don't be afraid, because the man who tried to kill you is the same man who wants to kill me. I will protect you if you stay with me." And these last words should have spoken to David's heart again, but he missed it again. What do you do when God doesn't show up the way you thought he would? You take matters into your own hands again. David, in many ways, is a reflection of ourselves. There's going to come a time in your life when anger will push you to do something that you don't want to do. Or your sense of isolation and loneliness will cause you to think about the things you wouldn't normally think about doing. Because our emotions are so powerful. The story of David reminds us what can happen when we take matters into our own hands without God. As we close part 2, I'd like to leave you with 3 questions that may help you. And they are on your handout sheet inside your bulletin. When you find yourself facing one or more of these giants, first, what is your loneliness, anger, or fear causing you to consider that you've never considered before? Could your emotions be leading you to do something that you wouldn't normally do? Second, who besides you do your considerations put at risk? And by asking this question, the things you're considering are now becoming options. Because you will find the answer is the people you love the most. And the people who love you the most. And some of you have experienced this growing up in your own family. Because when your father's anger went out of control, it affected you. Or when your mother's depression due to loneliness got out of control, it affected you. So who are you putting at risk? Who else's future hangs in the balance of your personal decision during your time of rejection, anger, or fear? And third, what advice would you give someone who is you? If you had the opportunity to give yourself advice during this time, what would you say? For some reason, we think we're an exception, but the reality is you're not, and I'm not. And David wasn't either. And when you read Psalms, you will hear this in David's writings. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. Stronghold means a place to flee in times of war. David experienced what it was like to take matters into his own hands. And David experienced the outcome of his own decisions. And the outcome was always disaster. David thought, just as we think during difficult times, God has abandoned me. But God never forsakes us. God is waiting for you to come to him. Come unto me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. If David was with us right now this morning, I believe his advice would be this. When you face a giant, don't run. As lonely as you feel, do not move without God. As betrayed as you feel, don't move without God. And as angry as you feel, don't move without God. If you feel forsaken, you are mistaken. because God is with you, and he will lead you out of the valley of despair. Let us pray.